Wonderful. Hi, everyone, and welcome to webinar 11 of the Soil Health Training Program webinar series. This is webinar 11, Soil Health Economics and Funding, and today is Tuesday, February 27th. We want to thank the Lake Champlain Basin Program and NUIPIC for the funding to create this program. And today we have two great speakers from the American Farmland Trust who will be speaking to us about soil health economics and funding. Just as a quick overview of where we are, as per usual, we're almost to the finish line of the webinars. This is the second to last webinar, and next week will be our last. And then we've got 3 out of 4 dates for the summer workshops, and working on that 4th and hoping to have that to you by next week. As I mentioned at last week's class, there was homework. It wasn't necessarily directly related to today's conversation, but I hope some folks did get a chance to read chapter 18 on nutrient management. Interesting stuff. And I'll just advocate too, if you haven't read the full book, or if there are chapters that we skipped over that you want to read, please go back and read them. That book is a great reference and a great resource. And with that, I am going to introduce Alissa White, who lives in Huntington, Vermont, and works as the Senior Manager for Climate and Agriculture at the American Farmland Trust. She has been doing engaged research with farmers in New England on climate change and soil health for over a decade. And Alissa, I'll let you take it away, and thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, Lauren, for inviting us. It's a treat to be part of this webinar series. And I imagine, since there's so many folks from Vermont on the call, that I may know a number of you. I've been working on research and programming with farmers in Vermont for a long time. And I recently, well, a year and a half ago, started working with the American Farmland Trust, but I still have quite a few projects collaborating with folks in Vermont, but now I get to kind of extend across the region. I have Cheryl Cesario's name up here because originally we're going to have Cheryl and Aaron and I present together, and Cheryl is at another event today, so she can't be here, but she did share a couple slides. A lot of the work that I've done in Vermont has been on farmer perspectives on conservation programs, payment for ecosystem services, and soil health and climate adaptation. And so I'm going to share a little bit of some of that background work that relates to our conversation today about soil health economics and funding. And Cheryl has quite a bit of experience doing lots of different types of advising with farms, and I think really likes to put kind of a farm viability perspective on that. So she would have been a great person to incorporate into this. All right, so at this point in your program, you're probably really excited about soil health. You understand that soil health provides all kinds of different ecosystem services. It benefits farms. It helps mitigate climate change. It helps address water challenges. I bet you're really excited to get out in the field and support farmers in adopting practices and changing management to enhance soil health and ecosystem services. And those management changes, those are the primary thing that farms can do to enhance soil health. And so from some perspective, it's all about making management changes. But how do we help farmers make management changes? There's a cost to that, right? So there's 2 topics for today's conversation. One was funding and one was economics, right? And I thought, let's start with the easy one. What funding do we know about in Vermont that supports soil health management practices? And thinking that I actually didn't check in with Lauren in advance to see if we can use the chat during this, but I wondered.
We can.
We can?
Yes.
All right, so folks, use the chat. Can you see this on my screen? I've got the chat in front of the slide.
We still just see the
funding
slide.
Programs? Oh, okay. Put them in the chat. What funding programs do you know of that exist in Vermont to support soil health on farms? Yes, Agency of Ag. What else? Come on. Yes, NRCS, the biggest source of funding for soil health in the state. Anything else? Yes, AFT RCPP. Thank you, Heather. That's right. We have funding for soil health in half of the state. Yes, and there's a number of different RCPPs, which is an interest. RCPP is a NRCS run program that partners help administer. Any others? Okay, I think there's some more. So I'm gonna move us along. Here's the I came with last night. So the federal NRCS programs, those are the primary sources. That's like the biggest pots of money for soil health practices in the state of Vermont that we can help farmers access. And those are primarily cost shares. They pay per practice, and they pay for kind of like part of the cost of the practice. And then there's also land rental programs, and there's a bunch of different ones. I don't think we have time to talk about the details, but if you don't know what these all are, find out what they are. The next is the State Agency of Agriculture has some water quality assistance programs, and they have a ton of different ones that support soil health practices. And then there are a bunch of nonprofit programs. I probably don't have the full list, but BHCB has some really great grant programs that farmers really like. The NOFA Vermont Resilience Grants, farmers have been using those to fund soil health in their farms. American Farmland Trust has a couple different things going on. We have this RCPP, which offers enhanced cost share. So a lot of the same practices that are covered by EQIP, we cover those at 90 or 100% cost share rate. We have microgrants, we have this new ecosystem services program, and we also have free soil health testing. And if you haven't seen it yet, I think Lauren's staff created this really great guide, which we should put in your follow-up reading if you haven't already looked at it. Sorry, is this a repeat? Lauren, have you already talked about all of this already? Okay, great. I thought this was the day for it. Okay, but I'm sure you guys have heard of this fun and sometimes controversial term called payment for ecosystem services. And there are new types of payment for ecosystem services programs that compensate farmers for ecosystem services like carbon sequestration that have gotten a lot of excitement lately. There are these performance-based ones that pay farmers per metric ton of carbon dioxide. But what payment for ecosystem services programs are, they're essentially just generally public or philanthropic funded programs that compensate farmers or landowners for making changes on their farm that result in ecosystem services that benefit the environment or society as a whole. And so all of these programs are PES programs. They're just maybe not, they don't get that label wrapped on top of them, but they are the biggest existing programs that pay farmers for ecosystem service provisioning in the country, especially the NRCS programs. And there's some innovation going on around how programs work and the different titles that they use, but I consider all of this PES programming. And so a lot of my work has really dug into how these programs can be designed and work best for farmers, how much they need to pay to make sense for farmers, and how we can help them meet farmers' bottom lines. All right. We are in an unprecedented time right now in terms of funding for soil health. So the IRA funding, that's federal funding that has increased the pots of money for EQIP and CSP and ASAP in every state. Those are just growing tremendously over the next couple of years. And so I wanted to share, many of you probably already know this, but in terms of there being funding for soil health, now is like a golden moment to really support farmers in getting those getting enrolled in those programs and getting changes on the ground, because there's almost like too much money to put out. Like, I think the limit is actually folks like you that work on the ground getting farmers enrolled in programs. And you can see it's just, it's like triples from 2024 to 2026, the amount of money that there is for these programs. I'm not sure what it'll look like in 2027, 2028, or 2029, but it's likely not to be sustained at this level. So it's a historic moment. And we can share with you the Climate Smart Ag and Forestry Practices list, and those are the practices that are specifically funded by most of these programs during this time. Okay. Also, if you haven't seen it, the State Agency of Agriculture Water Quality Program has a really nice guide to all of their different programs. There's the FAP, which farmers love because it's so straightforward. There's a BMP program. There's CREP, which is like it's like a land rental. What else? There's SEEP, that's an equipment fund. There's a grass waterway and filter strip program, which I don't think gets talked about enough, but especially if you're working with farmers who have pasture that's really important for them. And there's a pasture and surface water fencing program, which is also, I think, underutilized. A lot of these, if you talk to folks that run these state programs, they describe them as kind of like filling the gap after the federal programs from NRCS. And then there's two new programs that the Agency of Agriculture runs to support soil health practices, and probably not just soil health practices, but also kind of infrastructure as well. There's the CSP Assist program, and that is really because farmers, we wanted to get more farmers enrolled in CSP because there's so much money available there, but one of the burdens was farmers didn't think it was worth the time to enroll in the program because it's a bit complex in terms of enrollment. And so the CSP Assist program is basically built to just give farmers incentive payments to sign up for CSP. And then the PFP program is, I think, is too big of a conversation to get into today, but it pays farmers per pound of phosphorus. And that's considered kind of like an extra, right? Like it's not based on the cost of the practice. It's just kind of like a bonus performance-based program, which is pretty new. Oh, and here's the slide about AFT's RCPP, which I couldn't help put in there, but we do have a bunch of soil health funding. It's not on the Champlain Valley side of the state at this point, but we offer an enhanced NRCS cost share funding pool for practices and land rental activities, which is really parallel to EQIP. We have direct $10,000 grants for farmers through our New England Farmer Microgrant program. And we have a new performance-based pilot program that rewards farmers for ecosystem services that we piloted last year and will be growing again this year. And we offer free soil health testing. Lots of other nonprofits have similar programs. So I just wanted to share that as an example. Okay, now for the main meat of the conversation, which is about economics. There's all the funding, there's lots of follow-up to do. Maybe it was a review and you already knew that, but I wanted to make sure that got shared as part of this training. Okay, so now we're gonna talk about economics. What is economics? Is that just money in the bank? What's the meaning of economics? If we were in a classroom together, I'd be making you raise your hands and like talk to each other about this. Feel free to put it in the chat. So I looked up the root origin of the word economics because I don't like to talk about just money. But the origin of the word economics is from two Greek words. The first is oikos, which means home, and the second is nomos, which means management. So economics is more, at its origin, a term that is used to describe home management. And I think that's really valuable for our conversation today about supporting farmers in adopting conservation practices and soil health practices, because while money is really important part of the picture, it's not the only thing that influences adoption or decision making. There's all these other pieces that fit into the picture, right? Same for you. You're probably not in this job because it's all about money, right? There's other aspects of your motivation and challenges that have you in this position. If it was all about money, we'd probably be working for banks, maybe not for conservation. Same is true for farmers, right? Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about this kind of the way that thinking about supporting farmers and making change in terms of like a bigger decision complex. All right, so I started by saying that like getting to soil health and ecosystem services, it's management. That's kind of the major way that farmers can increase soil health on their farms and provide ecosystem services both to their farm and also to the broader environment. But in terms of adopting those practices and making the management changes, it's not just about management, because management is part of this bigger decision-making complex on the farm and for the farmer. And so when we think about those decisions to make changes on the farm, it takes time, it takes people. I think people's just personalities kind of come into play in terms of what kind of practices they want to use. Sometimes there's the influence of whether or not they have young children or older children that are playing a part in the farm that fit into their decisions. And so it's I think it's worth thinking about that. All right, so what does the research in Vermont say about how farmers make decisions about soil health and ecosystem services? So I'm going to share with you some research that I've done in the past. In 2019, we did 3 focus groups with 24 farmers across the state of Vermont. And it was a really interesting time because it's just when the farmer watershed groups were starting to talk about payment for ecosystem services, and they were knocking on the door of the state and asking them to think about that as a tool. So it was a really interesting time to talk to farmers. And I wanted to ask them about, what was informing their decisions, and how they thought about ecosystem services when they made decisions. And then, of course, they talked about PES programs as well, because that was happening at the time. So this is a open access article. I can share the link with you and put it in your follow-up reading. But it really details a lot about how farmers think about soil health, how they think about ecosystem services, and how that plays into their farm management decisions. And I think it's at a really interesting time in terms of the PES conversation in Vermont. All right. And so when I share this research, I feel like it's just a really great opportunity to share farmers' voices. So I have tons of great quotes. I'm going to fill your screens with that for a minute because I think it's worth sharing some of this from their perspective. When we asked them what are the most important things that they considered when making management decisions on their farms, they talked about so many different things. It was almost overwhelming. And I think it's important to remember that I'm going to go through a number of different factors, but they're often really interconnected, right? So a lot of farmers think about keeping their farm in agricultural production. And so when they're making any kind of change in the farm, that's a lens through which they see that decision. One farmer said, we think about what's going to keep the farm in agriculture because there are so many things working to take the farm out of agriculture. And I think the second one here, the economic viability constraining all of their other goals was a theme that we heard across from all of the farmers. Some of them talked a lot about environmental stewardship being a motivation more than others, but everyone felt like they were constrained by economic viability. So money really matters right now. One farmer said, what can we do with what we have? For us, it's the finances that are often limiting things, or our time. And that's in relationship to finances. So practices that you think are a good idea for a farm, you want to encourage them to enroll. I think being really conscious of how much time farmers have and how much it takes to implement a practice is really important because that matters to them in terms of making that decision. The quality of life piece, I think, is really important and often overlooked. So one farmer that I was talking to talked about tractor time, and he's excited about soil health, but he loves driving his tractor. And he talked about how in the 80s he would do like recreational tillage because it was so fun. And he had this big smile on his face. And so maybe that's not the best example of quality of life, but in this context, but it really sticks out in my memory is that like some of the tools and the implements and the way that people spend their time on their farm, it's because it's not just their livelihood and their income, it's like how they like to spend their time and what makes them happy. And so for those of you that work directly with farmers as advisors, I feel like it's really important to keep that in mind as you're talking to them about specific soil health practices that they might adopt. All right, and here's a really great quote about how their decisions are influenced by like tons of different complex factors at a time. So one farmer said, I think there's a diversity of considerations related to quality of life, economics, and ecosystem integrity on the land. And perhaps things like how it would affect, future production capacity. Would taking on this management affect other aspects of management on the farm? So it's not a simple question to answer, but there's a bunch of different factors. I think that one speaks for itself. Of course, farmers care about regulatory pressure. People are concerned about how likely they're going to be to get in trouble for doing things. And when we asked these questions of farmers, we weren't specifically talking about soil health practices. The question was like, when they make decisions on their farm, what do they take into account? So they think about the cost of compliance, and especially around water quality in Vermont. A couple years ago, that was really high on people's minds. I think it still is quite a bit now, although they're a little more used to the RAPs. A lot of people are also thinking about their legacy and who's going to take the farm on, and because they're thinking about the transition to the next generation, and the expansion, or whether or not a farm era or legacy is there. And so some farmers talked about also land tenure. On fields where they're leasing and they don't have long-term land tenure, they may be less likely to invest in soil health because there's kind of like, it takes a little time for that to come into effect. Um, some farmers are also just super excited about soil health. Like they're kind of dork out about it. Like it's a fun thing to talk about with your peers. And so that comes into play as well. Um, all right. Pests and diseases matter in terms of decision making. A lot of farmers also think about reducing inputs and using less trash. And so when we're, I think a lot of soil health conceptualization is in row crops and in pasture conditions, but we have quite a few dedicated vegetable farmers and kind of small scale farmers who think a lot about using black plastic mulch and the trash that it generates. And so reducing inputs and thinking about just the impacts of using plastic is something that farmers think about quite a bit. And farmers are also thinking a lot about animal health. And for some, that's their highest priority. They just love their cows or their sheep and care about how they're doing. All right, I think this is the last one I've got to fill your screen with lots of words from farmers' voices. And I think I'm going to read these three because I think they're really important. So the first one is about how ecosystem stewardship is constrained by livelihood. So when we asked one farmer about what they think about when making decisions on their farm, they said it would need to enhance our livelihood. So it would be an economic decision. But with all of that, we also think about the impact we're having on the ecosystem around us. So we take that into account because we're not going to trade one off for the other. It has to be both. The next one is about just the new and urgent challenges that often come up and dominate available time and resources, like the hottest burning fire at the time, and that may not be soil health and conservation. So this farmer said, we'll try to eliminate our biggest problem at the timing that it is. One year it's one thing, one year it's another thing. It's never always just one thing. It's always different. And finally, I think especially because we wanted to talk about economics today, I think understanding that number of farmers are kind of locked in kind of dependent on a path that they're in because of the investments that they've made or the debt that they're in. And so this one was from a dairy farmer, I think in Lawrence district. And he said, I got equity, but cash, I am cash poor. It's the milk price that has done that. What we do in the environment, we do the best job we can. But if we can't survive with the milk price, we're not going to farm like that. We can't afford to. We're not going to do it to lose all of our investments. And right now, to sell your investment, you're getting 50 cents on the dollar. That's why most people are still staying in, because you can't afford to get out. So especially for larger farms, that's kind of the reality that they're dealing with. Okay, so those are the key pieces from that research that I wanted to share to just kind of preface this conversation about farmer decision making and the importance of considering economics when supporting them in adopting conservation practices. I also just wanted to share a couple other things from some research we did a couple years later. So that first study was from 2018. And what I want to share is just a couple of highlights from some research we did on payment for ecosystem services program design in 2022 with a number of other people. We did a farmer focus group in January, then we did a survey with almost 200 farmers from across the state about compensation and ecosystem services and conservation practices. And then we did some follow-up interviews in the spring about what was meaningful compensation for them and what they thought about performance-based programs. And all of this work is available in summary reports. So I'm just going to share a couple highlights from it. Okay, so from the survey we did with almost 200 farmers from across the state, we asked them about ecosystem services, compensation and programs, program design, conservation practices, their motivations, their perceived capacity and beliefs. And Noor El Nabulsi was one of the primary people that helped distribute and conduct and design the survey. I think one of the most important things we learned is that across the board, farmers have a really high level of stewardship ethic. So they're really motivated and care about the environment. They have a high level of knowledge and skill when it comes to soil health, but they really need greater financial capacity to make those changes. So we found that 90% of Vermonters believe they have a responsibility to be part of climate solutions, which is really high compared to other parts of the country. 82% of Vermont farmers believed that we are in a state of climate emergency due to human-caused climate change. So climate change awareness and activation is really high among farmers in Vermont. 94% of those farmers believe that they have the knowledge and technical skill to enhance soil health, but only 58% believe they have the financial capacity to. So I think that just stats to really kind of reiterate what we heard in those focus groups. This is also really important for those of you that are pushing farmers to sign up for programs. We asked them about their greatest concern when entering a new conservation program. Maybe you knew this, it's the burden of paperwork and the time, and then it may not be worth it. So this is our little word cloud from the farmers' answers to that. And cumbersome paperwork, a lot of time, extra data collection, complex data entry. They're pretty much all about red tape and too much paperwork. So the other piece of that research for the PES work in Vermont that I wanted to talk about is these interviews that we conducted. So Noor El Nabulsi, Heather Darby, Lindsay Rule, Ellen Frederick, and I worked on this together. We interviewed 34 farmers about administrative burden, compensation for maintaining high soil health, their opinions about compensation for enhanced soil health, and really thinking about compatibility with existing programs and practice-based payments. We asked them about universal basic income. We talked about all the kind of the hot topics at the time. And I just have one slide to share what I think are kind of the biggest takeaways. So as I mentioned before, farmers really, when they think about programs, I started off talking about like what is influencing farmer decision-making and management changes, and that's a little bit different than decisions to enroll in a program. But when farmers think about enrolling in a program, they're weighing off, whether or not the compensation that they'll get from enrolling in the program is worth it. And that's not just the cost of adopting the practice, it's also the worth their time to understand the program, to do the paperwork, to do the compliance. And I think that there's a lot of different ways to think about, can it be worth it? And so when you're working with farmers, I think emphasizing all of the benefits that you can about the practice is really important, because they have a lot of considerations and concerns in mind about the burden of enrolling in a program. Some programs are now offering incentives that support farmers' time in doing the paperwork or sharing data entry, and I think that's really helpful. But anyways, all right, so we heard from them a number of different types of burdens that deter participation. That's the paperwork and data reporting, the cost of the management changes in farm activities. There's also some other things. There's some distrust of government. And I think land tenure was also a really important piece of that. So if they don't have secure long-term land tenure, then they may be concerned about participating in a program. It's not germane to the whole conversation today, but we heard some really, really valuable and interesting perspectives on what compensation means. And while most farmers are limited in terms of finances to make changes on their farm, there's lots of different types of value that come from programs and that they associate with soil health and soil health education. And so they think about those monetary payments as helping offset the cost of changes, but they also really are excited about programs that offer any kind of learning or technical assistance. I think farmers really value the work of conservation district staff and extension staff in Vermont, and we heard a lot of really great perspectives on folks like you that work directly with farmers and how valuable you are. A lot of them also really care about the soil health benefits and those ecosystem services that really align with their kind of intrinsic stewardship motivations that they hold. A lot of farmers really care about data. They're excited if they get information back about soil health or something related to their farm agro-ecosystem performance. And then they also really talked about how programs that offer opportunities for them to learn from other farmers are really valuable. Oh, all right. So now I have Cheryl Cesario's slides. She's not here, so I'll do my best. But I love that the first one is her really distilling down, which I think comes out of that research that I shared. The most important thing for to farmers when making that change is that it makes economic sense. And so, farms are businesses, and you've got to have that. And there's lots of other stuff and goals that farms can have, but it's really important that the books, that the economics work so that they can keep going. So I think, show me the money, right? Like sharing the numbers on why investing in practices makes sense is really valuable to farmers. So any work that you can do to support them in understanding that a little better will help them. All right, and I think Cheryl really likes to emphasize that economics and finance are really different. You have to put the economics before the finance. So the economics is, should I make the decision? Does this make economic sense? Does it balance out? But the finance is, can I? Where will the money come from? And those are two really different things, right? And sometimes I think even when there's cost share money and there's programs that are supporting part of the cost of the practice, it may not actually make economic sense. Like the finance might be there, but the economics might not work out for the farm. And I think Cheryl thought it was really important to share that kind of insight with you. The farmers have to consider whether the practice makes good economic sense for their business, thinking about depreciation costs or additional labor costs that may not be built into that kind of initial input. Also ongoing operation and maintenance costs and how cash flow may affect that. So if you don't have increased cash flow, but you have increased maintenance costs, then that's not going to work out for you. And then, even if there's like a lot of cost share money, the cost share usually doesn't cover 100% of the practice. And so you have to make sure that you have that other piece. So say you've got you're getting $150,000 in cost share to help you build a barn, you still have to come up with the other $100,000. And you may not have the cash flow to be able to support that. It's kind of like if you're on a budget and there's a sale, you shouldn't go buy stuff just because there's a sale, right? But you might be enticed by the program or the financing that exists. Here's Cheryl's guide to hidden costs that every business needs to account for and maybe doesn't always take into consideration when they're making that first decision. One is the unpaid labor. So that's the time of the farmer, right? What would it cost if you weren't there and you had to hire somebody to do that? Sweat equity. Is there an agreement for a future payout? Depreciation. So that's like the loss in value over time of machinery and animals. Opportunity costs. So that's maybe what you're missing out on if you spend your money on this current opportunity right now. Opportunity rent, even if you own it free and clear. And then underutilization of a capital investment. Sunk cost bias. What does that mean? Look at the cute little picture in the corner. If we don't get rid of the anchor, the ship will sink. No, the anchor is so expensive. It's really cute. I want to keep it. So I think that's Cheryl's perspective on people hanging on to stuff, even though they should get rid of it just because it was expensive. So, and I think we maybe heard that in one of the quotes from the dairy farmers that I shared in the beginning. And that means just continuing to invest time or effort in a project that isn't working, or pouring money into something that wasn't panning out and not being able to stop. And this is something that happens not just on farms. I'm sure we can all relate to this or have a friend that maybe we've seen it in. The more we invest in something, the harder it is to let go. That's a real thing. And here are some examples that Cheryl wanted to share from the field. So continuing to fix a machine that repairs are more than it's worth. So the cost of repairing it is more than the worth of the machine, just because you love it. I have a farmer's market with low sales, and I keep thinking next week will be better. This time is subsidized with free labor. So if the farmer's market isn't really paying out, but you keep going anyways. I set up an online store, but it doesn't generate sales. The store remains online and has a monthly fee. I've already spent so much on this. Yeah, hard to let go once you've invested in something, thinking that it might work in the future. I built a barn for an enterprise otherwise it doesn't work, but I keep doing it because I built the barn. Great examples from real life. Okay, I think this is my last slide before I hand it over to Aaron, because I think Aaron's presentation is way more exciting and interesting because he's actually done like the economic cost benefit analysis on soil health practices. So this is a really long intro to the best part of the presentation. But I think the key things I wanted to share at the end here is that many farmers are paralyzed by the future and uncertainty when they're thinking about making change. And it's hard to make that decision to do it. And I think it's good to be aware that like the first question for them should be, should I do this? And sometimes it might be no, and that makes sense for their farm and their maybe their family and their personal life and their livelihood. Even if it seems like a great idea to sign up for all the soil health practices right now, it might not make sense for them. And so just, relating with farmers as humans that are dealing with this situation is really important. Because management changes on farms are so context specific, I think seeing it work on another farm is often the catalyst for adopting a new practice. And I hear that from farmers all the time. Once they've seen it work somewhere else, that really inspires them to feel like it could fit on their farm and can make it work. And so any opportunities you have to support farmers and learning from each other or seeing practices work elsewhere is really valuable. And then having that confidence in the financial cost benefit analysis can also really help them kind of make the decision to adopt a practice. So I think those final pieces of advice from some of this work and our experience in the field is that taking the time to understand the context of the farm and the farmer and their family and their livelihood is really important. Emphasize all the benefits of a practice, even the not just the closest hanging fruit, but all of the benefits. Talk about examples of where something works, where you've seen it on another farm, try to get them to go to another farm where they've seen a practice work. And then be open to thinking about other options if it's clearly not like a good fit for them. And then if you can show them the numbers, that's always good. Okay. That's my part.
Thanks, Alyssa. I'm not seeing any questions in the chat, but if anyone does have any questions, please feel free to toss those into the chat or come off mute. In the meantime, I will introduce Erin Ristow. And so Erin has a background in soil health and 22 years in the field. Erin's work to identify solutions for farmers facing unique problems on their operations. Erin leads the Genesee River Watershed Demo Farm Network established by American Farmland Trust in collaboration with the USDA NRCS, partnering with 20 operations to support the adoption of regenerative farming practices in New York's Genesee River watershed and surrounding areas. Through the Demo Farm Network, Erin works with farmers to increase knowledge about on-farm conservation systems that build soil health and benefit the environment. Identifying farms with a history of incorporating soil conservation practices, he takes a scientific and historical approach to evaluating the impact of no-till methods, cover crops, adaptive nutrient management, and other soil management methods on a farm's viability and improved environmental outcomes. He has a master's of science in soils and biogeochemistry and in international agricultural development, both from the University of California, Davis. Erin, thank you very much for being with us today, and feel free to take it away.
All right, thank you. And thanks, Alyssa. That was actually a very good introduction for a few reasons. One, it was just good, but also it really set up this talk here. There's a lot of overlapping information. So I think that's good to reinforce what Alyssa said. And also my introduction, my bio is too long, I realize, so I'll work on that. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen and hopefully I can do this correctly. Okay. And now I can't see anybody, but you can see my presentation, correct, in the full mode?
Yes, it looks great.
Okay, great. So yeah, so today I'm going to talk about the economic case studies that were done in New York and basically how they can be used as communicating the economic benefits of adopting soil health practices. And so I do work right now exclusively in New York, and I just wanted to give a brief background of American Farmland Trust. I don't know the audience here that well, but just in case you're not aware, we have three main tenets here that we follow. So we're trying to keep farmers on the land, trying to protect farmland, and then promote sound farming practices. And that's the area that I work in, is promoting the sound farm practices. So in New York. So just a bit of background. So this is about the economics, but I thought it was important to share about the Genesee River Demonstration Farm Network, because it is one thing that Alissa mentioned was, farmers seeing these practices implemented on other farms, particularly their neighbors or someone that close by. It does help them see that it's possible and maybe how to do it. And so I think by seeing it with a neighbor or your peer makes it a little easier to at least take some risk and try it out. And that's really the main point of the Demo Farm Network, is to highlight these farms that are doing practices that we want them to be doing, and highlighting those stories. And so so you can see here, learning from local farmers with successful soil health implementation, learning about changes in the economic benefits and the costs from their real life experiences. And then we also get the farmers with their observed changes. There's things that we really can't measure directly or quantify, but they anecdotally can say, well, the soil was a little easier to work through, or my corn stood after a heavy rain where the other corn was washed out, or my neighbor's corn was washed out, stuff like that, and anecdotal evidence. They've learned how to integrate these systems into their own farms, and so we can learn from that. And that's really what the main thing is of the network. So it's located here, in this blue area, and that's the Genesee River, so Western New York. And we're now up to 20 farms, and those 20 farms alone have about 50,000 acres total, and about 60,000 head of livestock. So you could tell we targeted some larger farms here with the network, but that was because they were able to provide us the background information, the data that we needed. I'm also doing on-farm research, replicated field trials. So they have the equipment that makes that easier to do, to collect the data and to get the yields and all that. So the key components of this network is that it is farmer-led research. So like I said, we're looking at planting green right now, and some other tools, biochar, looking at adaptive nitrogen management, a few different projects there. But the farmers are helping design those projects and how to use them on their farm. Again, farmer to farmer learning is a really key component of this network, because we, again, believe that they're going to learn from their neighbors much better than, especially me, showing up and waving my arms around and smiling a lot and trying to get them to do things is not as effective as their neighbor, someone that they know and respect. And we do have things like providing participation payments, and help them with planning other conservation activities. Some of the farms do have a net return guaranteed payment if they have a yield loss as a result of our field trials. So we're helping with the plot design, data collection, outreach, and education. And part of what we're doing is the economic analysis for their farms. So these are some of the farmers that we're working with. Again, these are real farmers, real farms, and that's so I think that's important. It's not just on a research plot somewhere. These are real people with real issues and challenges that are overcoming or trying to overcome or have overcome. So with the case studies, there's this common belief that adopting soil health practices does not add up. So that sometimes it's like, well, I would like to do that, but it's going to be such a long-term investment, or I won't see the return. Just all these, a lot of the things that Alissa already touched on. But I do believe that there is economic and environmental evidence that the soil health practices work, and it is based on these real farm experiences and demonstrated on real farms, told through the case studies. So again, better than me talking here, I thought we would start with a video of a few of the demo farms, and I'm going to play this assuming that you can hear the audio. If not, I guess someone chime in. But so I'm going to play this video. It's about 5 minutes, but it tells the story better than I can, I think.
Farm name is Hargo Farms, stands for Harold and Rose Gould. My grandparents started the farm in 1956. We're at an organic dairy farm. We milk 230 cows. We crop around 700 acres in corn, hay, soy, triticale, sorghum, and about 200 acres of rotational pasture.
My name is Jay Swede. Our farm is Gary Swede Farms. We work about 4,500 acres and we grow a few different crops: corn, soybeans, wheat, alfalfa, processing vegetables, sweet corn, string beans, peas.
Some of the soil health practices we're doing is cover cropping, reduced tillage, and nutrient management, manure injection. Being organic, our only nitrogen source, or majority of our nitrogen source, is cow manure. So just getting as much nitrogen into the ground for the next crop as we can, utilizing the nitrogen without losing the nitrogen, I guess, to the atmosphere.
American Farmland Trust got involved with the Demonstration Farm Network as a response to hearing from farmers that one of the biggest barriers to implementing soil health practices is a lack of information. So the Demonstration Farm Network is a way to gather data, but also to be an outreach tool to other farmers from the data that we have in order to educate farmers and help them to make better, more informed decisions on implementing soil health.
My name is Blake Glover. I'm the state conservationist for NRCS here in New York. Farming is a business and they have to make business decisions, but their most precious commodity is the soil, right? And the environment. And for us to be in a position to address some of their questions, and their number one question is going to be, what's it going to cost me and what's the benefit to me?
So we always have been a conventionally tilled farm in the past, where we'd plow the ground, we'd fit the ground, we'd cover the ground, we'd go over the ground several times to get it ready for a crop. And over time we started noticing that our soil was becoming less workable. And so we saw some people playing around with what they called strip till. And you're leaving your ground undisturbed in between the area that you want to work. The strip till is just a way of managing your soil so that you're not tilling it up every year and ruining that structure that you have.
Our reason for switching to no-till and reduced tillage was primarily just cost savings, less trips across the field. The benefits of no-till are being able to plant in the residue and always having residue. So in transitional periods when you don't have anything growing, you have something holding the soil there.
On the economic case studies, where we see the biggest gain in net income is through the reduction of tillage. So when you go from 3 passes or 4 passes to 1 pass, the savings on labor, on fuel, on wear and tear of the machinery, those all provide a significant increase in savings for your farm.
The economic benefits for our farm mainly came when we switched to strip tillage. That was probably one of the biggest changes we've made on our farm. And what it did is, instead of covering that ground so many times and using so much equipment and going over it, we just reduced it down to more or less 1 pass before we plant. And that was a huge benefit to us. But not only that, we were able to take and manage our nutrients so much better. We're able to place our nutrients right where we want to use them, and we're just so much more efficient with it. Not only reduced the amount of tillage that we did, but we increased our yields at the same time. And that was probably the biggest economic benefit we could have had.
Our program work is heavily directed by the input of the farmers in our region, and so they've identified soil regenerative practices as a priority focus for our team to implement work in.
So working with American Farmland Trust and the Demo Farm Network has kind of given us the ability to understand the practices that we've had in the past. We knew they were working, that we knew they were a benefit. They really helped us quantify it. We put a number to it, and it kind of opens your eyes a little bit more. Just makes you understand what you're doing is really beneficial, and we understand it better, and it kind of gives us the ability to try some more things and try some new things and see what else we can do.
Back to the presentation. So I think I could probably just end there, but I'm going to give you a little bit more detail. So yeah, so you'll see Jay Swede here coming up. I'm going to dive into his case study a little bit, and then give another example of a dairy. So I had this row crop grain farm, and then a dairy as an example. So let's get into that. So in New York, we have 9 economic and environmental case studies, but American Farmland Trust has done several more of these in other states. I don't believe there's any in New England, but when a lot of this funding was available, New England was a much smaller team, and I think that's why they didn't participate. But anyway, here we are in New York. And with these case studies, we wanted people to read them, especially farmers, so we tried to make them short. So there are 2 pages. This first page has a lot of detail on their background, kind of how they got, what kind of farm they are, how they got into their journey, and a little bit of an introduction to the economics. And then on the back is really the results. So we have, it goes into, what the economic piece. And I'll touch on this briefly, but we also did some environmental modeling on the soil health practices as well through the nutrient tracking tool and the Comet Farm USDA models. And so there's the results of that in there too. But the main thing here is this table that shows the increases in net income and decreases of net income from adopting practices. So what does that look like here? So zooming in a little closer, and this actually is Jay Swede's partial budget table. That's what this is called. So we did use a partial budget for our analysis for a few reasons. One reason is because it's just easier for me to explain what we did. It's a simple economic approach because we're only looking at what was different between the baseline. In this case, it's the before soil health practices, and then what changed, only looking at the things that changed. And so what you have is, for example, you can kind of look at this as a balance, right? These 2 tables are like a balance. And so we're starting with kind of things being equal, but when you start to take away things, right? Like Jay was saying, you reduce tillage, so you're reducing the number of passes, or you're in decreasing your inputs. Perhaps your nutrient management is a little bit more efficient, so you're able to reduce those costs. That weighs that income. You're going to increase your income because now you're not spending as much money. On the flip side, you do things like purchase cover crop seed and plant it and terminate it, or you have to do learning activities. You have to learn how to do these things. So you're spending time like on a webinar here, listening to stuff. So that has a cost. And so that kind of then tips the balance that way. But what we want is for the balance to tip towards the increases in net income when we're talking about soil health. And so that's the idea of the partial budget here. You take things away, but then you add things compared to the baseline and get the results. This is a little bit into the weeds here, so I just wanted to have this slide as a reference for later if these slides are shared. But I did do 2 different types of economic analyses, and they ask a little bit different question. That's a little bit too much in the weeds for this, but just know that some of the earlier ones done in New York were done with this retrospective soil health economic calculator. And then the other one was done with the Dairy Farm Business Summary, which is a Cornell program. And the main difference is that the RSHEC tool is isolating practices and associating those particular practices with an economic cost or loss. Where with the Dairy Farm Business Summary, it's an extensive database that a farm has going back, in my case with the farms I'm working with, 10 to 20 years. So it's just an extensive database. And what we look at is, okay, they adopted their first soil health practice like a no-till or strip till in 2010. So we look at their whole farm economic analysis before they adopted, and then compare it to what their whole farm economics are after. And you can see these variables that we looked at. And so it's asking a slightly different question, which is, can soil health practices be adopted and the farm remains profitable? So that's a little bit different than saying, because I adopted no-till, I am now more profitable. It's just saying that, you know, you're more profitable even though or after adopting these practices. It's not like a direct correlation. So it's a subtle difference. But when you look at the case studies, they basically appear the same, and the point of it is the same. We're trying to show that you can adopt practices and remain profitable. So these are the three RSHEC and DFBS, Dairy Farm Business Summary, case studies that were completed. The other three that make up the 9 are more directly looking at planting green economics. So I'm not going to talk about those today. This is more of a whole farm analysis. So you can see these different practices: strip till, minimum till, no-till, cover crops, nutrient management. These are all very common practices with these farms. So to dig into Jay's here with Gary Sweet Farm, you can see he's located in Western New York, and so his motivation to adopt these practices were, they have had cover crops on their farm since the 80s, but they weren't really focused on it. It was just kind of an afterthought. And, you know, like he said, his dad always wanted something growing. But they really expanded it starting in the early 2000s. And then they also married it with reducing their tillage. And so that was what motivated them. They really wanted to just see some improvement in the tillability, the tilth of their soil. And you can see here in a recent wet year, the best corn crop was where the cover crops were. And I've heard that from many farmers. So you did already hear he's a fairly large farm. He did adopt strip till, no-till on some of his crops, nutrient management, cover crops. So he's cover cropping about 450 acres a year. And he likes to use a mix with that. So he's often using a mix, or he uses rye as well as a single species. It just depends on what crop he's following. If he's following wheat, where there's more time for that crop to get established before the winter, then he uses the mix. If it's after corn silage, then he's using rye. And like I said, he had this compaction and erosion issue, and he wanted to reduce inputs. So I'm going to get into the results here a little bit more, but he did have this annual net income per acre of $55 an acre increase, and it was a 345% return on his investment. So just looking at it a little closer, what is it that is helping him here? So he did report a little bit of a yield increase due to the soil health benefits, and so not all the farmers are actually reporting that. He did, but I would say most of the farms actually just said that their yields stayed the same, but they were happy because their inputs were reduced. But Jay did attribute some of his yield increase to adopting soil health. So he had a little bit of an increased income there, and then he had decreased costs from reducing tillage, which you heard in the video, and Jace also said, which is fairly straightforward. You're reducing your wear and tear on your machinery, your fuel, repairs, operating expenses, paying someone to sit in that tractor, all that sort of thing. And it's not just that you're paying less, then you have more time to do other things, which is also very important. So he also has a more efficient use of nutrients due to injection and split application. So he's reducing his inputs there, and then he also is reducing his erosion that allows for decrease in repair costs. Like I said, he has more time to accomplish tasks in spring, and they can kind of focus on things more and do a better job at managing other parts of their farm. That sort of has this cascading effect down the line of profitability. So over the study area, which actually wasn't his entire farm, it was 1,500 acres of this 4,500 acres, but he had an overall per acre increase of $71 per acre. On the flip side, there was no decreases of income identified, but he did have to spend time setting up the planter to handle the residue, all the cover crop costs, including the seed establishment and either harvesting or terminating it, learning costs, right? So he had to go to learn how to just do the nutrient management better, the injection, how to do cover crops, all this stuff. So he had a decrease in his net income of $16. So if you take that $71 of increase with the $16 of decrease, and you end up with the $55 per acre and the 30, which is a 345% return on his investment. I did mention, even though this is an economics discussion, we did take the time to look at the environmental benefits, and so I just thought I'd share that. So with his farm, both the Comet farm and the nutrient tracking tool, which is an NTT, they only allow one field. So even though the economics is a whole farm, we're looking at just one field, and his field was a 25-acre field. So he had a reduction of nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment of 40, 92, and 96% respectively, and over 476% reduction in this greenhouse gases, which is like taking 2 cars off the road off of just this one 25-acre field. And then he's observed less wind and water erosion, improved infiltration. That all happened pretty much immediately. So yeah, less fall tillage saves fuel. So he notices, I hear this a lot too, the snowmakes remain wider in the winter because there's less wind erosion.
Hey, Aaron.
Yeah.
Sorry, we do just have a quick question from the chat.
Sure.
A slide or two back, how was the per acre value of decreased erosion determined?
Oh man, yeah, good question. I'd have to look. I'm sorry, it's been so long since I did this one. But there was a value put to, I believe, the labor that's involved with sending a piece of equipment out there to repair that. I believe that's what it is. I do remember looking at how much, doing some Russell runs and looking at what that would be, but in terms of loss, soil loss, but I believe it was directly related to the amount of hiring equipment to go out there and do the repair.
Okay, it does look like the person who asked this question said it was one more slide back to that he was referencing.
Okay,
yeah, Tom,
yeah,
if you want to
see
come off mute, feel free as well.
Yeah, that's fine. I'm sorry, I can't see anybody, so I'm just talking to 2 screens here. But yeah, the
Hi.
value. Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry. Hi, Aaron. I was just curious. I'm always curious about values people place on soil loss. So here it is in the per acre column. Value of decreased erosion due to soil health practices, $2.25 an acre. Does that represent a quantity of soil?
No, okay, one thing that I was going to share at the end, the methodology of this is on a website, so I will share that in the chat. But I believe that it was actually, and I'm sorry I can't answer this better right now, but I can follow up with you, with the whole group. But I believe it was really more about the equipment going out there.
Okay,
so
sure.
I probably broken into the per acre, but I think he gave us a value of each time I go out, it costs me roughly $500, and I do it three or 4 times.
I see. Gotcha. Yep. Thanks.
Okay. Yeah, I'm sorry, I can't really see anything, so I'm just talking to the air right now. So I appreciate you cutting me off and jumping in. So anytime you need clarification, please do that. So one thing that he did have to get, he did struggle with getting the seed placed in the center of the strip till. They did invest in auto steer and RTK, which is kind of like I would say like a on-farm internet system that really helps them get very precise, within millimeters or centimeters, certainly for planting. And so not every farm can do that. But that's what they had to do to really nail this down and get good with it. That kind of cost wasn't really set into our overall analysis because that wasn't just for soil health. It was kind of like an investment that they put into the farm. It certainly helped them, but so we didn't count that as a cost in this analysis. If they had to buy a piece of equipment, but they were going to have, usually when farmers are getting into a soil health practice, it's a tipping point. They have to buy a piece of equipment anyway. So then they're like, well, should I go for the old thing or something new? And so we didn't count that as a cost either, because they would have to buy something anyway, a piece of equipment. And with a parcel budget, you're kind of just looking at things that changed. So just so you know that. So he did have some agronomic barriers as well, especially with oats getting too thick and sealing the ground. So it prevents a good seal to soil contact. So there were things that they had to adjust for. And Jade, like you saw, he's been doing this since 2005. He still says he's learning, and he doesn't consider himself an expert. He's humbled when I ask him to speak in front of people and stuff. So, I think it's just every year you have to learn something. But the point is he's doing it. They're making progress year by year. And you can see here there was 16 hours and $440 for learning. That was part of the cost. So his yield improvement equated about $72 an acre of an increased income. And he said, so he just estimated 1/3 of his yield increase was to the use of the soil health practices. He also thought genetics, made a difference, and equipment and being able to be more precise. But he did say that some of it was because his soil was better. He eliminated 3 tillage passes, which saved $23.43 per acre. He was able to reduce his fertilizer costs. He did have to invest in some technology. And he did have some challenges to overcome, but overall he did have this profit. And more than putting a number to it, I just think that he still does it, right? Like, he's been doing this for nearly 20 years, so he must see something out of it to continue to do it. So I'll give you another one. So, I'm not going to go through 9 of them, but I did think just a couple of examples so you can kind of see. And this is also, I picked this farm because they're a dairy, but also because we use the dairy farm business summary as well. And so you can kind of see there really isn't too much of a difference when it comes to sharing and talking to somebody else about this. So Forrest Watson is in Avon, New York. It's Western New York as well. And so his motivation was attending the National No-Till Conference and hearing stories from farms there, and seeing the success of others. And so he really is interested in regenerating the soil functioning and improving the soil biota. But overall, he wants to be more productive with fewer inputs. He's really trying to reduce as much inputs as possible, because that increases the profit. So with the no-till drill, we're capable of planting more acres given available resources. So his farm is 2,600 acres. They grow corn silage mostly, and then some grain, wheat, and alfalfa grass. And they are either no-tilling or strip tilling. Typically, he starts with strip till, and then on a field, he'll start with say they pick up a new piece of land, they'll start with strip till, and then as that soil improves, they can go to no-till. He cover crops everything that he can. I mean, some of his farm, is covered in wheat in the winter or alfalfa grass. So, he's not planting cover crops everywhere, but his soil is covered throughout the winter. And yeah, they're using manure injection, drag line, and they rotate their crops. So he, again, we'll get into this, but they actually had a net income per acre of $75 and a return on investment of 129%. So his increases in income were attributed to an average of higher average of yields on both corn, grain, and wheat. And the wheat is a higher value crop, so that helped with the increase of profitability there. Yeah, and then not only, so then he was, by reducing tillage, for example, they were able to, in this case, be more consistent about getting their wheat planted. And then that's a higher value crop. They then are making a little bit more money. So this is kind of how it can have effects down the line. And then they switched to no-till, which takes less time, reduce fertilizer applications due to better nutrient capture with cover crops and injecting manure. So he had an annual increase of 133 per acre. And then the decrease was, so we're only presenting the differences in cost, not the actual current cost per acre. So it's not costing him $2 per acre. That's the difference from what it was before, just to be clear. So he did have some machinery upgrades over this time, not necessarily for soil health. And then the seeds and plants reflects all changes in the seed expenses across all crops, cash crops, forage crops, and cover crops. And then due to fewer soil preparation passes, they had to spray more often at times. But yeah, so the difference in the dairy farm business summary here is looking at the entire farm. Like I said, where with Jay's, it was specifically just looking at, they were tilling, now they're not. This is more like all these different categories. Then we saw these changes after picking his tipping point of adopting his first soil health practices. Again, there's a paper on this online. I can share a link. It's really beyond the scope of this to really get into too much detail unless you have a specific question. So then he had this $58 per acre of decreased net income. So putting the 133 with the 58, he got this $75 per acre, which is 129% return on investment. And then looking at his environmental observations, he saved time and fuel with less tillage, increased organic matter, reduced synthetic inputs. His cover crops are improving the soil, which helps facilitate the no-till. And reduced erosion, increased infiltration. These are all things that he has reported to us. So the need to till due to compaction is virtually gone. We're breaking up compaction with roots instead of iron. So his first year of cover cropping was a total failure. They tried to interseed ryegrass into corn using broadcaster, and it got shaded out. And it was also a dry year. And I do think broadcasting cover crop seed is generally pretty risky anyway in terms of success. But in year 2 they adjusted and they used a drill and it started to work for them. So like I said, now he uses it everywhere that the field is open, they'll put cover crops. They had a dry year in year 3, but the increase in soil moisture from the cover crops and no-till led to a successful crop. The point of this is that it's not going to, I think that, for a farm, sometimes timing is very important, especially with cover crops. If they happen to try cover crops their first time ever and it's a really dry year and that fails because it was really dry, but that's their experience, that's kind of tough. Sometimes farmers try it their first year when it's the perfect weather and then they just love it and keep doing it. So sometimes luck's involved, but with every farm, they're all learning it. They're not perfect the first time out, and every year is different. So they're learning every year. So he had a higher value of crop production, and he was able to reduce his fertilizer and lime costs. And again, this is just looking at his whole farm. So we picked, I forget which year he started. I'm going to just say 2013 roughly. And, from that point forward, we could see in his economic analysis from almost 20 years of data that these costs were higher, or I'm sorry, the the crop value of crop production increased after that time, or the fertilizer and lime costs were reduced. One of the things that I wanted to highlight here that we saw with several farms that we did the dairy farm business summary is that the total range of annual value of crop production was narrower under the soil health compared to conventional. What that means is that their soil is more resilient, their crops are more resilient. So their range, so if there's a dry year or a really wet year, that their waves of yield that window is much shorter, it's much tighter, it's more predictable. So they're not seeing, super lows when something comes through. Like they're not getting hit as hard as their neighbors, and you can actually see that in their yields stabilize over time with soil health. So in his case, I would say that even though he did report higher average yields, I don't go around saying that you're going to get higher yields. It's more about stability, yield stability, and reduction of inputs. I think that you're going to be able to show with farms more consistently. Just summarizing the RSHEC case studies, looking at kind of there's three of them. I presented one to you. Overall, like I said, the yield did have this, it either didn't change in a couple of those farms or a J did report an increase. They were able to, all three farms decrease their costs through tillage. There were learning costs, but they all had some sort of net income change. So like Swedes was the highest at 55. Another one that I didn't show was, I think, around $45 an acre. And then the $11 an acre was an organic dairy. So they already were doing a lot of stuff to begin with. So they had a little bit less of an impact, but nonetheless, it was still a positive impact. And I wanted to just highlight like another important thing, although this is probably less important to farmers, is the environmental benefits. So looking at the nutrient tracking tool, this is across 7 farms of those case studies. We're seeing, 31, 64, and 70% for MP and sediment losses. So reducing those. And we got up to 99% of sediment loss from one of the farms. And with the climate improvement, the Comet Farm, we're seeing a weighted average increase of, it's not greenhouse gas emissions, it's more about carbon sequestration, but it's 263% on average, which is about 6 cars off the road. For this, you can see here we have this average field size of 27 acres out of all the fields, and so there we go. So and it's using the same idea of a before scenario versus an after scenario. So I'm kind of past the economics, but I want to make this point that we should be promoting a systems approach to adoption. So like, for example, reducing your tillage does free up resources to then help you implement cover crops because you have more time, maybe some more money. So trying to combine these practices together is really what I try to show. And one part of this is showing the soil health benefits. So I used the Cornell Comprehensive Assessment of Soil Health test to take over here, this field. This is where I actually took the soil test from. So I took a test here in this field that Jay's had since 1985. And then I took a sample from this forest that's probably been forested since the 30s or so. And so this is kind of like a baseline condition of this soil. It's like its natural state. And so I looked at the health of the forest. So you can see, big surprise, it's almost perfect, right? It's scored in the hundreds or upper 99. So it scored very high with physical, biological, and chemical properties, parameters of the soil. And looking at this field, there's a lot of green in here. There's some areas that can be improved, like this aggregate stability, but overall, this field is approaching the natural conditions. So this actually was taken from this is an actual picture taken from this field when I sampled. So combining these practices, right? He's doing strip till. He is putting a lot of manure on here, which does help. But there is this improvement of soil health here on one of his fields. And this is the idea that there's an additive effect. So combining different practices will get you to a healthier state faster and to a greater degree, right? So if you're looking at this line here, just cover cropping or reduced tillage is going to get you in this area, but combining different practices is going to build that soil health to a higher degree and quicker. And the same goes for managing for climate mitigation and resiliency. So kind of the same idea here is combining these practices is going to help you improve your soil organic matter in your soil, which is where soil organic matter belongs. And so, this is again another kind of benefit to the systems approach. You're gonna get your goals of soil health faster and to a higher level by combining the practices. And so I am about to wrap up here. Just have a couple slides, but tips for sharing the case studies. So I would say, I think Alissa mentioned this as well, that most farmers at this point know about soil health and that it's important and they should be doing stuff to do it. So it's not really about educating them, I don't think at this point, maybe some, but for the most part, I think most farmers that we interact with, especially ones coming into the office looking for help, probably already know this. So, it's really important to just listen to what the farmer says their concerns are, what their barriers are, what they're trying to overcome. So like Alissa again mentioned that every farm there was so many different barriers that, she had to clump some of them, but there's a long list because every farm is unique. And so you want to listen to them and then be clear with your message. So, what is important to them? Some farms really are about reducing their inputs, or, some do want conservation on their land. So just be clear and match your message with what their most important goals are. And if you do look at these case studies, they're available online, and they are a lot of them are co-sponsored by the NRCS. Try to match, you're not going to give, so if you're talking to a dairy, give them examples that are from the dairy, because that's going to be, or if it's a smaller farm, try to find a case study that's a little bit smaller of a farm. Just, as much as you can, try to match them. And that is a challenge to these case studies, is that one, they take a lot of time to produce, but doing economics, we haven't really figured out a way to do it on a large scale very effectively. So you kind of do have to go farm by farm. And what I'm hoping is having enough case studies out there that some farm out there can relate to one of them. And so we keep making them, and hopefully you can find one that matches your situation with a farmer as much as possible. And before you go in there, like me, I'm not doing this next bullet point, understanding the PBA enough to explain it to the farmer. So, like that question about the soil, I'm sorry, about the erosion, if I'm start stumbling like I did, right? I stumbled through that answer. I do believe I gave you the correct answer, but that's just going to put a little bit of doubt, into a farmer, if you start to like hem and haw, well, I don't really get this, either. It just kind of, it jeopardizes the credibility of them. So, if you don't have to be you don't have to be an economist to do this, but at least have a fairly good understanding of what's happening in those tables. And I would even explain it to somebody, try explaining it to a partner or a coworker or something, that see if it makes sense to them, and try it out. Because it's not okay to know, it is okay to not know everything, but at least try to know someone who does. So you could also say, well, I don't know, but I will reach out to Aaron and see if he can answer that question. And like I said, this is available. The RSHEC approach, which is like I said, it's the retrospective soil health economic calculator. It's kind of two pieces. It has this questionnaire, which is not just one page, it's many pages. So it's in an interview combined with an Excel spreadsheet, which I think is going to be made available online soon. And so you can learn how to do these and be trained to, you don't have to make a case study from it. You can do the economic calculator piece if you wanted to share it with a farm. Especially the PSHEC is the predictive soil health economic calculator. And the ones that I did looked backwards, but it would be, if you adopted these practices, here's what you could expect to happen. And so these are available online. There are videos on how to do it. I would be happy to also dig a little deeper with the smaller group at some point if there was interest. But you can do these with farms. These tools are publicly available. You do need some help though. You can't just pick it up online and start doing it. You would need to kind of get some training first, but they are available. And with that, I'm done. I just also wanted to introduce Ben. He's part of the team, so I wanted to include him, but that's all I had.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Aaron. I just want to encourage folks to please keep adding questions to the chat or come off mute if you have questions. I am going to get started with a couple questions I had, if that's okay. Just thinking about the case studies that you are showing, you did kind of touch on this towards the end. But what was the time frame from before to after, and how much of an impact did weather have on yields, especially in those comparisons and case studies?
Yeah, so each farm was different, but how we determined the before and after was asking them when they adopted something. And it wasn't always a clear line. Sometimes like Jay, for example, had done cover cropping since the 80s, but it was kind of an afterthought. He wasn't intentional about it until 2005. So we said, okay, we'll do 2005 is where we start. So once we pick that date, then it's not really you're not really, for the RSHEC approach, you're just saying, okay, well, you used to not do cover crops. Now you are. So, how much are you paying for seed? How much do you pay to terminate it? That sort of thing. So or with the yield, it was, did you notice a yield increase? And like I said, most of them said no. So we just said, okay, we'll move on to the next question. So that's the case with the RSHEC. With the dairy farm business summaries, we had weather was taken into account in the sense of we had yield data with going back to 2000, the year 2000, let's say. Each farm was a little different. Some farms actually went back into the 90s, but so there was the yield overall. But looking at forests, it was from, let's say, 2000 to 2013, we had that data set, including the yield. So including all the weather that affected that yield, those 13 years. And then we had from 2014 to 2020 or whatever. I don't remember what year I finished that case study, but so then it would have included all the weather and everything after that. So it's not adjusted for weather. One thing about these case studies is, as much as it kind of looks researchy, it's really not research, because we didn't set up an experimental design. It's retroactive. It's kind of taking a situation and developing a story around it. There is definitely solid methodology behind it. There was a handful of ag economists across multiple agencies that reviewed these and helped develop the approach. So I feel solid about it, mostly because a farmer, Jay, is willing to stand up in front of his peers and say that he believes that number is true. But beyond that, there is robustness to this information. But at the same time, it's not science in the sense of setting up a design and asking a question. So a specific question and then going forward from there. Yeah, so it does include weather, but it's not really, weather was not a variable that we directly looked at.
Awesome, thank you. It seems, I think in your summaries, every farm ended up with a net increase in income when they made this change, just more soil health practices. Were there any, I guess, were there any farms that you're familiar with that like it might have actually been a net loss of income? Because it sounds like very convincing if every single farm that you guys have looked at came out with a net positive income. I guess I'm just wondering if there's any other data to the opposite.
Yeah, there's lots. I'm just not sharing those. No, I'm kidding. We surprisingly, for me, every farm that I interviewed going into it, you don't know what the results are, and it's talking about like you're holding on to something that you're investing time in. Like, you know, these take 4 months or so to go down the road, and so you're hoping that it has this great result because you spent so much time. So amazingly, every farm that I've looked at has shown these profits. The one that almost didn't was this farm here, actually, that you can see a picture of. Hargo Farm is a organic dairy. I mentioned it earlier. They looked like they were going to show a loss of, you know, $5 or $8 an acre. I can't remember now because it was some years ago. But then what ended up bringing them above into profitability was that we included their double cropping triticale. So it serves as a cover crop, but really it's not officially a cover crop because they're harvesting it and using it for feed. So we counted that the cost of what it would be for feed, and then that brought them into profitability. But all the other farms, it was just clearly that reduction of tillage makes a huge difference. So if you can eliminate passes, you're most likely going to be profitable. The thing about Hargo is that because they're organic, they still have to till quite a bit. Like they till their corn and soybeans for weed management, and so he didn't see as much of a gain, and almost had a loss. So if he wasn't double cropping for the feed, but you know, that triticale does has that ecosystem service of covering the soil and putting exudates into the root. Through the roots into the soil. You know, but yeah, they would have had a loss. So, but reducing tillage really is a big savings of money.
Yeah, related to that, I guess, were there any other practices that really influenced farms besides changes to tillage?
So even though it costs more, I would say that the cover cropping for sure is something that the farmers see immediate benefits to their soil, largely due to infiltration. So they're seeing, you know, that water not ponding or running off. So I think that they all kind of, once they have that experience with it, that they stick with it because they also can see their tractor is just a little bit easier to get through the soil, you know, when they are planting or like strip tilling in this case, you know, which there is some soil disturbance there. You know, it's some of it's subtle, right? Like, okay, so now you're saving 3 seconds an acre, you know, with plowing, like that adds up though, you know. So there's I would say cover cropping for sure is one that they have all adopted. And actually the egg census, there's some information out there, at least from the 2018 one, where farmers who adopt cover crops are sticking with it. And then I think so even though there is a cost, they're seeing the benefit in the soil, so they're sticking with it.
Awesome. That is very helpful. Thank you. Again, folks, please feel free to put things in the chat. If not, I'll just keep talking. So this is on you if you don't ask your own questions. I'm wondering if any of your case studies involved trying to analyze intensively managed rotational grazing on farms versus just like a simple crop harvest.
So we did not at the time that we had the funding, that because there wasn't a calculator for it. So they focused on row crops in the early stages. And then if a farm had to be a dairy in order for us to use the dairy farm business summary. So, if they are intensively rotating, like, well, so Hargo is, right? They're rotating their herd. But we looked at yeah. So the short answer is no. I'm just trying to tell you why. But the short answer is we did not do that yet. But I know that they are developing a tool for that as well for grazing. But we didn't have grazing farm other than this dairy. But I kind of am thinking more of like a beef operation. We didn't really have any grazing in our demo farm network for lots of reasons, but it's something we're trying to fix. But yeah, so no, we didn't do that. And there isn't any, there isn't any other in other states yet that I know of either.
Okay. Did you look at any like really small veggie farms or anything like that as well? I'm just thinking about like a Vermont context.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we did not. There is one case study that's kind of out of these. It was in Long Island, and we looked at one field of sweet corn. And also saw improvement. I can share that one as well. But the challenge is that those farms tend to not have the kind of information that we need. They don't keep the kind of records. They often they don't keep the kind of records that we need, like in terms of yield consistently. It's also really complicated with so many different crops that can be in there that again, not only is it complicated to analyze, but for me to now then try to explain to somebody like this group, I would spend 20 minutes just going through the methodology. I'm making up a number, but we needed to try to keep these simple, and the vegetable systems are not, and they often just don't have the data required. So I do think that we will start to see some down the road, but this economic analysis, I think one reason why you have me is because there's not a lot of people doing this. And there are going to be more people. There certainly are already. The Soil Health Institute has done some stuff as well. They have some good economic analyses that they've done. But we had to prioritize where we started. And I think for all of us, this is kind of a philosophical discussion, but if you're talking about water quality or greenhouse gas emissions, that involves a large scale of the landscape. And for me, at the time that this was started, I was the only one here in New York doing this work for American Farmland Trust. So if I'm going to cover 50,000 acres, which would have an impact on water quality, I have to work with a big farm, because then like Jay is 4,500 acres. If I work with him, then I'm affecting, in theory, 4,500 acres. And if I was to do a vegetable farm and they're 10 acres or even 200 acres, I just don't have the time to really have that same impact. So we targeted these bigger farms initially for that reason.
That makes perfect sense. Thank you. We do have a question in the chat from Whitney. How do you reconcile the idea that variables should be studied in isolation to most accurately assess them versus your suggestion that farmers should incorporate multiple new practices at once to maximize benefits?
That's a good question. I was going to give an aside that, yeah, I think ideally you should start with that, change one variable. So yeah, don't try to do everything all at once. Like with Jay, they did not change everything all at once. They did the tillage first and then incorporated their cover crops a few years later. Yeah, all these farms, they did do it incrementally, but the point is they were reaching for something more integrated and combining practices. So I 100% agree that you would want to do some incremental changes. And so that's where you have to talk with the farmer and figure out their goals, and also maybe take a soil health test Like, so if they have a field or two that are really giving them some problems, like you could take a soil health test and find out like what's the biggest constraint. And then there's different practices that can be associated with those constraints. A lot of times there's overlapping practices, so you can have tillage addressing a few different issues or anyway. So yeah, there's a whole nother talk on the soil health management planning and approach, but I agree with you. It should be done incrementally, but the sooner that they can get to combining practices, I think like I showed, the quicker they'll get the results that they're looking for. But of course, you don't want to get overwhelmed. Otherwise, you're going to set yourself up for failure. So incrementally is good.
Thanks, Aaron. I have a slightly unrelated question. I've had a couple farmers say to me that only square fields make you money. And I was wondering if you've heard that, if you have anything to say to that related to this idea.
Yeah, I have. So, I've kind of seen some images, some work that was done where you kind of look at a field almost like a storefront. So if you go into a grocery store, they put stuff out in certain places because that's where people walk and see it, sort of thing. So there's parts of a store that generate more profit than other parts. And it's like that with a field. You'll have areas of a field that are never profitable no matter what you do. It's a low spot, so it's wet, or it's a high spot, so it's dry. And a lot of those areas, in some ways, I've heard it be argued should just be abandoned. But then you don't have a square field, right? So if you're kind of doing, moving around different parts of the field, but I think that farmers, that's kind of where precision ag would come in, I guess, where you can look at your yield monitors and see where, like, okay, I literally lose money every year here. So what's the point of putting nitrogen there and farming it? So but how that relates to this, I would say that what we've seen with that dairy farm business summary is that their profitability did increase after adopting these practices. And some of it is because, like in the case of Forrest, that he can devote more time to the higher value crop of wheat and be more consistent about it. So even if in that field itself there's some low spots, if you're kind of doing a shotgun approach and treating things, getting the crop out there, overall they're being profitable. But it's not easy, I guess. All of this, I mean, it's super easy for me to sit here and talk about these 4 principles of soil health and just go do that. Like that's really, it's actually that simple, is to say go do these things and it's going to work out for you. But to actually do it on someone's farm is very difficult for them to figure it out. And it's probably like a doctor. Soil health is kind of like human health, where we all know we should eat less and exercise more and meditate and do these things, but a lot of people don't do it because how do I do it? Like, how do I find the time to make healthy food or go shopping or go to the gym? Like don't have money to do that. So we all have different resources and different constraints for our own health. And it's the same for the farm. So like a doctor can say over and over, meditate, diet, exercise. Oh yeah, that's easy. But this part isn't easy. And so I do think that each farm just has to figure it out, and the ones that can't, then unfortunately they don't make it. But it does take some intelligence on the farm part. It takes a certain tolerance of risk. It takes a mindset. It takes a different mindset, and that's part of what these case studies are trying to do, is to change the narrative that I'm going to lose money. Because again, with human health, okay, I have a gym membership, but now I'm not missing as many days of work, because when there's an illness that goes through my office, I don't get affected because my body's stronger. So I'm taking fewer days off, or I'm a little bit more productive, so now I'm getting a raise or a promotion or whatever. It's like, yeah, I'm grasping a little bit there, but the idea is, that yeah, it's not easy to do. And now I lost my train of thought. Sorry, it's really hard to do this. I'm just looking at my screen talking to to nobody, so I apologize for rambling.
You did great. Thank you, Aaron. I'm actually going to give you a break and tag Alissa in for a question. If you're still here, Alissa. I was recently chatting with a farmer who said that their payment for participating in some of the programs related to ecosystem services actually ended up bringing in more income than their milk check did. And I guess I'm just wondering if you wanted to speak a little bit towards the PES conversation, where it stands now, nationwide or in Vermont. I guess if you have any thoughts there.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think I may know which farm this is. This is the PFP program.
They're in the PFP program, and I believe some other programs associated with UVM. I am not sure which programs.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's really impressive. And surprising. I think, the PFP program, the performance-based ones, are an experiment. I think we're learning a lot about how those complement the other existing programs. One of the things that I didn't talk about as much, but the interest around performance-based programs in Vermont has really seen a lot of conversation and evolved over the last couple of years, from being farmers really leading the charge and asking for those types of programs to be paid for providing environmental services as like another income stream, and to use the performance as the source of that income. So have the monetary contribution be based on metric tons of carbon or pounds of phosphorus or the performance. And through the research we did for the PES working group, we really came to the conclusion that it's better for farmers for programs to be based on the cost of implementation, because otherwise it's really just too risky and unknown, whether or not the payout from those performance is going to cover the cost of implementation, right? And so either those performance-based programs should be additive, like a little extra frosting on top of the cake or the meal, right? Or they should be practice-based. And that those those performance-based programs that are based on pounds of carbon or tons of carbon or pounds of phosphorus, or et cetera, that those are a good fit for meeting environmental goals, but not really a great fit for farmers who have to think about the bottom line, the cost of implementation. So I feel like the tide has really changed in the last couple of years in terms of who is excited about the performance-based programs. I still think that we're learning a lot and that there's a role for them to play. I wonder if the payout from the PFP program, they're using a model there and it's retrospective. I think that it's kind of exciting that that's helping that farm enough. And I don't know, I feel like I think that farmers should be compensated for all of the other goods that they provide to the community, not just food. But I also think that we wouldn't have to be having these conversations about all these different new programs to add if we actually were paying farmers a fair price for the food that they're producing, right? And if the price of food covered the cost of production. And so I feel like there's like bigger economic challenges that I wrestle with. Sorry, that was I don't know if I answered your question well.
You totally nailed it. I really appreciate it. And Aaron, I do appreciate you tossing all those links in the chat. We'll make sure to save those and get those posted on the campus page as well. We just have a couple more minutes left, and I guess I would just invite any other questions from folks. Also, if Aaron or Alissa wanted to just share anything else that you maybe didn't touch on that you think technical service providers or technical assistance providers going out to farms should really take to heart when talking to farms about making changes related to soil health, we would welcome those as well. All right. Melissa, it looks like you want to say something.
Well, actually, I was like, if we had a lot more time and we were an in-person class, I would ask all of these attendees about what works for them, right? Because I think this course was really geared towards people that are starting to work directly with farmers or maybe have some experience with that. And so I feel like doing a little sharing across what's working well for them in terms of talking to farmers could be really interesting.
I will note that down for some of the in-person days. Thanks, Alissa. Well, with that, I won't keep anybody any longer, but just want to really thank Alissa and Aaron for your time today. These are really interesting concepts. Definitely something that is easily forgotten, I think, when talking to a farmer. So just really appreciate all of the work that you've done. And I will just wrap up with a final plan for our next and final class, which will be a week from today on Tuesday, March 5th. And we will be talking about soil health management planning. So really the holistic piece here with Carissa Stein. We would also appreciate anyone who could fill out our evaluation form and are very grateful for those of you who are filling out that evaluation form. And our homework for next week is chapter 14. That doesn't look right. That might be the wrong number, but the chapter is called Putting It All Together, but I'm guessing it's not chapter 14 based on the fact that we just read chapter 18 and that was not the end of the book. But the chapter is called Putting It All Together. I apologize for the typo there. And we hope to see you all then, and thank everyone for your time today. Please let us know if you have any additional questions. Thanks all.
Thanks, everyone.